Welcome to Land of Horror. Today, we will continue our journey to explore the most chilling mysteries. Do you have the courage to face spooky stories, terrifying legends, and unexplained supernatural phenomena? Join me as we delve into haunted places, dark secrets, and legendary figures that will send shivers down your spine. Before we begin, make sure to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss any videos, and let's step into the world of Land of Horror together. Get ready, because thrilling moments await you. Are you ready to explore? John sat in the worn, creaky armchair by the fireplace, the only source of light in the dimly lit room. The house he lived in had been passed down for generations, a sprawling yet aging estate that loomed over the countryside, its walls holding stories and secrets from the past. John had grown up here, but it had never felt as cold or empty as it did now. It had been 2 years since his wife, Emily, passed away under circumstances that still haunted him. She had died suddenly, collapsing one evening in the very room where John now sat. The doctors had called it a heart attack, but John had always felt that something wasn't quite right. He had this gnawing feeling that there were questions left unanswered. Ever since that night, the house felt different, almost as if it was alive, watching him. He shook his head, trying to push those thoughts away. The crackling of the fire was the only sound breaking the heavy silence that draped over the room. He reached for the old, leather-bound book on the small table beside him. Reading had become a way to distract himself from the loneliness and the uneasy feeling that had settled over the house since Emily's death. But as he tried to focus on the words, his mind kept wandering back to her. He missed her voice, her laugh, the way she used to hum as she moved around the house. Without her, everything felt wrong. Suddenly, a soft sound broke through the stillness. At first, John thought it was his imagination, a trick of the mind. But then, it came again, a faint, distant voice calling his name. "John!" He froze, the book slipping from his hands and landing with a soft thud on the floor. His heart raced. It wasn't just any voice. It was Emily's. He sat perfectly still, listening, straining his ears to hear it again. Surely it couldn't be. She was gone. He knew she was gone. But the voice had been so clear, so unmistakable. "John!" There it was again, coming from deeper inside the house. It was distant, as if it was coming from the hallway or perhaps the upstairs bedroom where they used to sleep. His stomach twisted with a mix of fear and confusion. How was this possible? Was he losing his mind? He stood up slowly, his legs trembling beneath him. For a moment, he debated whether to follow the voice. His logical mind told him to sit back down, that it was just a figment of his grief-stricken imagination. But another part of him, the part that still longed for Emily, pulled him towards the sound. He moved cautiously through the house, the wooden floorboards creaking under his weight. As he stepped into the hallway, the air felt heavier, thicker, almost suffocating. The shadows seemed longer, darker than usual. His breath caught in his throat as the voice called out again, this time louder, more urgent. "John, please!" It was coming from the staircase. His pulse quickened as he made his way up the stairs, each step filling him with a sense of dread. He had never been a superstitious man, but there was something deeply unsettling about hearing the voice of a dead woman, his dead wife, echoing through the house. When he reached the top of the stairs, he hesitated. The hallway stretched out before him, silent and still, the doors to the bedrooms closed. The voice had stopped. He stood there, waiting, listening for it again. But all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. Just as he was about to turn back, there was a loud crash behind him, making him jump. He spun around, his heart in his throat. Downstairs, something had fallen. He rushed back down the stairs, his feet stumbling over the last few steps. When he reached the living room, He froze in shock. The armchair he had been sitting in moments ago was smashed to pieces, crushed beneath the weight of a heavy wooden beam that had fallen from the ceiling. His mind raced. If he hadn't left the chair when he did, the beam would have fallen right on top of him. The realization sent a cold shiver down his spine. John stood there, staring at the wreckage, his body trembling. His mind struggled to make sense of what had just happened. The voice, the crash, it couldn't just be a coincidence. Had Emily, in some strange, inexplicable way, saved him? He looked around the room, feeling the overwhelming silence pressing down on him. The house, once a place of warmth and love, now felt like something else entirely. A place where the past was not yet finished, where secrets still lingered in the air. That night, John didn't sleep. He sat in the kitchen, the crash echoing in his mind, his thoughts consumed by the haunting possibility that Emily had tried to warn him, tried to protect him, even from beyond the grave. But why? What was she trying to tell him? What had really happened the night she died? As dawn broke and the first light of morning crept through the windows, John knew one thing for certain. He needed to find out the truth. John couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him since the night the beam fell. The voice, the one that sounded exactly like Emily, still haunted his thoughts. Had he imagined it? Was it just his mind playing tricks on him, or had it been real? The events of that night made him question everything he thought he knew about his life. His house, and Emily's death. The days that followed were long and filled with a growing sense of dread. Every creak of the old floorboards, every whisper of wind against the windows seemed louder, more pronounced. John found himself becoming hyper-aware of the house's every movement, as if it were trying to tell him something. He could feel it. There was more to the house than he had ever understood. It was a chilly afternoon when John decided to start going through the attic. He hadn't ventured up there since Emily's death. It was a place filled with memories, boxes of old photographs, letters, and items they had collected together over the years. But now, John felt an inexplicable pull to go there, as though something was waiting for him. The attic door creaked as he pushed it open, the dust swirling in the dim light that streamed through the small window at the far end. The air was cold, and the smell of old wood and forgotten things greeted him as he climbed the narrow stairs. He had never liked the attic. It had always felt disconnected from the rest of the house, like a forgotten realm where time stood still. John began sorting through the boxes, sifting through years of memories. There were albums of photographs of their trips together, souvenirs from their travels, and letters they had written to each other during the early years of their relationship. For a brief moment, John smiled as he held a photograph of Emily in his hands, her bright smile and sparkling eyes looking back at him. But the warmth of the memory quickly faded, replaced by the cold reality of her absence. As John worked his way through the boxes, he found a smaller, locked chest tucked away in the corner, partially covered by an old blanket. It was one he hadn't noticed before. Curious, he pulled it out, brushing away the thick layer of dust that had accumulated over the years. The chest was old, much older than the other items in the attic, with an ornate lock that looked as though it hadn't been opened in decades. John stared at it for a moment, unsure of whether he should try to open it. Something about the chest felt different, as though it held something important, something he needed to see. After searching around, he found a small key in one of the other boxes. His hands trembled slightly as he inserted the key into the lock, and with a soft click, the chest opened. Inside, he found a stack of letters, all addressed to Emily. The handwriting was unfamiliar, sharp and hurried, unlike anything John had seen before. His heart raced as he carefully unfolded the first letter. As he read through it, the words on the page sent a chill down his spine. The letters were written by Emily to a close friend, someone John didn't know. In them, Emily spoke of a growing fear, a sense that something was wrong in the house. She wrote about hearing strange noises at night, seeing shadows move in the corners of her vision, and feeling as though she was being watched, even when she was alone. John's hand shook as he continued to read. Emily had never mentioned any of this to him. Why hadn't she told him? The letters grew more urgent as time went on, with Emily writing about her increasing paranoia. She described waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone, or something, walking around the house, but whenever she went to check, there was nothing there. In the final letter, Emily wrote about feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. She mentioned a specific night, just days before her death, when she had woken up to the sound of footsteps outside their bedroom door. She had gotten up to investigate, only to find the hallway empty. But when she returned to the bedroom, she had seen a figure standing at the foot of the bed, just for a moment, before it disappeared. John sat back, his mind reeling. Emily had been terrified, and he hadn't even known. The thought of her suffering alone, without him realizing, filled him with guilt and anger. He had to know more. He had to find out what had really happened. That night, as John lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about the letters. The more he thought about them, the more unsettled he became. Sleep was elusive, and every little noise in the house seemed to take on a sinister tone. He tossed and turned, his mind racing. Around midnight, a soft noise broke the silence, the familiar sound of a window creaking open. John froze. The sound was coming from the hallway, near the staircase. He knew that window well. It had always been slightly loose, but it had never opened on its own. His heart pounded as he climbed out of bed, moving cautiously towards the door. As he stepped into the hallway, the creaking stopped, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible whisper. It was faint, just at the edge of his hearing, but unmistakable. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he strained to hear it. Don't look! John's breath caught in his throat. He stood there, frozen in place, his pulse racing. The whisper was soft but clear, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He took a step back, unsure of what to do, fear tightening its grip on him. The silence that followed was deafening. He looked around, his eyes darting to the shadows at the edges of the hallway. There was nothing there. John backed away, his mind swirling with confusion and fear. He returned to his bedroom, closing the door behind him, but the unease remained. The whisper, it had sounded so close, so real. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling, his mind replaying the events over and over. Something in this house didn't want him to know the truth. Something, or someone, was warning him. As the night dragged on, John knew one thing. The house was hiding something. And no matter how terrifying it was, he had to keep digging. The unsettling events in the house were beginning to wear John down. Sleep had become elusive, and every moment spent alone seemed to stretch out endlessly. The letters he had found in the attic kept playing over in his mind, and the whisper he heard that night still sent a chill down his spine. He had to know what was going on. But more than that, he needed to know why Emily hadn't told him about her fears while she was still alive. The day after finding the letters, John decided to pay a visit to the small, local library. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but something told him that the answers he needed wouldn't be found within the walls of his house. Maybe there was something about the house's history, or something Emily had been researching before her death. Whatever it was, John knew he had to start somewhere. The librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Wilson, had known John for years. She was one of the few people in town who still remembered Emily, and she had always been kind to them. When John explained that he was looking for any information about his house's history, Mrs. Wilson didn't seem surprised. "You're not the first person to ask about that house," she said, her voice low as she led him to the back of the library where the archives were kept. John's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Wilson glanced at him with a serious expression. Your house has a bit of a reputation. People around here don't talk about it much, but there have always been stories. Strange things happening, unexplained noises, people seeing things that shouldn't be there. John felt a knot form in his stomach. He had always dismissed the local legends as just that, stories. But now, after everything that had happened, he wasn't so sure. He followed Mrs. Wilson to a dusty shelf filled with old newspaper clippings and property records. "There's not much here," she said, pulling out a few folders. "But some of these might be helpful." John spent hours poring over the documents. Most of the records were mundane, old property transfers, renovations, and the occasional article about local families. But then he found something that caught his eye, an article from over 100 years ago describing a tragedy that had taken place in the very house where John now lived. According to the article, a woman named Sarah had lived in the house with her husband in the late 1800s. Sarah had been well known in the town for her beauty and kindness, but the article hinted at something darker beneath the surface. It described how, in the months leading up to her death, Sarah had become withdrawn, paranoid, and fearful. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the house at night, and some even claimed to have seen shadowy figures moving behind the curtains. Sarah's death had been sudden, officially ruled an accident after she had fallen down the stairs. But the article suggested that there had been whispers of foul play. Some believed that her husband had been involved, while others thought that something else had driven her to madness. John's mind raced as he read the article. The parallels between Sarah's story and Emily's were too close to ignore. Both women had experienced unexplained fear. Both had become isolated in the months leading up to their deaths, and both had died suddenly under suspicious circumstances. But what was the connection? And why had this pattern repeated itself more than a century later? As John left the library that evening, the weight of what he had learned pressed heavily on him. The house wasn't just old. It had a history of tragedy, of fear. But there was still one thing that didn't make sense. If the house had this reputation, why hadn't Emily ever mentioned it? She had always been rational, logical, and they had both dismissed the local stories as nothing more than folklore. John returned home that night, his mind filled with more questions than answers. The house was dark and quiet when he walked in, but the familiar sense of unease immediately settled over him. He could feel it again, the strange energy that seemed to pulse through the walls, the weight of something unseen lurking in the shadows. As he stood in the kitchen, staring out the window into the dark, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was an email from Emily's old friend, Laura. She had been one of the few people Emily had stayed in contact with after they moved to the house, and John had reached out to her earlier, hoping she might have some insight into what Emily had been going through before her death. The subject line of the email sent a chill down his spine. Emily's journal. John's hand shook slightly as he opened the message. Laura explained that Emily had been keeping a private journal in the months before her death, and she had sent some of the entries to Laura for safekeeping. Laura had hesitated to share them before, but after hearing about John's recent experiences, she felt he needed to know what Emily had been going through. Attached to the email were several scanned pages from the journal. John's heart pounded as he opened the first file. The entries started off innocuously enough. Emily wrote about their life in the house, about settling into the quiet countryside, about missing her old life, but enjoying the peace and solitude. But as the weeks went on, the tone of the entries changed. Emily wrote about feeling watched, about hearing things at night, just like in the letters John had found. Then, in one of the last entries, Emily wrote something that made John's blood run cold. "I've been having dreams," she wrote. "Dreams about a woman. She's in the house with me, watching me. I can't see her face, but I know she's there. I feel her at night, standing by the bed. She doesn't say anything, but I can feel her presence. I've started to wonder if she's real, if she's somehow tied to this house. John closed his eyes, trying to process what he had just read. Emily had known. She had felt the same things he was feeling now. The presence in the house, the sense that something was watching her. But she hadn't told him. She had kept it all to herself, and now it was too late. As John sat there, the silence of the house pressing in around him, he felt the weight of the unspoken secrets between him and Emily. She had tried to protect him from something she had been too afraid to face herself. And now, it was his turn to face it. John sat at the kitchen table, the dim glow of the laptop screen illuminating his weary face. Emily's journal entries replayed in his mind, each word laced with fear and confusion. She had been haunted by something in the house. Something real, something dangerous. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he was being pulled into the same web of terror that had consumed her in her final days. Determined to get answers, John decided to take a more direct approach. It was time to talk to someone who might understand the strange occurrences in the house. He thought of Mrs. Wilson, the librarian who had mentioned the house's reputation. But first, he needed to gather all the information he could about the previous occupants of the house. Perhaps they had experienced something similar. John spent the next few days digging through old records, going through more property documents, and speaking with a few older locals who remembered the house's history. As he delved deeper, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The house had a history of strange, tragic deaths, much like Emily's. It wasn't just Sarah from the 1800s. Several people who had lived there over the decades had either died mysteriously or suffered from mental breakdowns. In one case, a man in the 1920s had reportedly taken his own life after claiming that he couldn't escape the voices. Another family in the 1950s had moved out abruptly after the wife had been found wandering the fields at night, muttering about shadows in the house. The more John learned, the more he realized that something sinister had been at play in the house for generations. He compiled everything he found and returned to Mrs. Wilson, hoping she could help him make sense of it all. "Mrs. Wilson," John said, as he sat down across from her at the library, "I've been doing some research on the house, and I've found a lot of strange things. Tragedies, deaths, people going mad. There's something wrong with that place. I can feel it." Mrs. Wilson nodded slowly, her expression somber. "I'm not surprised, John. That house has always had a dark energy. But it's not just the house itself, it's the land it was built on." John's brow furrowed. "The land?" Mrs. Wilson leaned in, lowering her voice. "The house was built on land that was once owned by a family with a dark history. In the late 1700s, there was a dispute over the property, land that was sacred to the indigenous people who lived here long before settlers arrived. The family who claimed the land did so through violence. There were rumors of bloodshed, of curses placed on the land by those who were wronged." John felt a chill run down his spine. "Curses?" Mrs. Wilson nodded again. "It's hard to say what's real and what's legend, but ever since the land was taken, strange things have happened to those who live there. Some say the land itself is cursed, that it holds on to the spirits of the people who suffered there. Others believe that something was unleashed, something dark that feeds on fear." John's mind raced. Could this be the answer to what had happened to Emily, and to everyone else who had lived in the house? Was there really something on the land that was affecting the people who lived there, pushing them to madness or worse? Mrs. Wilson continued, "I've seen people like you before, John. People who think they can handle it, who think they can fight whatever is there. But you need to be careful. The house, it has a way of getting into your head." John felt a wave of nausea wash over him. Everything he had been experiencing, the voices, the whispers, the sense of being watched, was part of something much bigger, something far more dangerous than he had imagined. And now, he was caught in the middle of it. Back at the house, the atmosphere felt even heavier, as if the walls themselves were closing in on him. John tried to keep his mind clear, but the weight of what Mrs. Wilson had told him lingered. The house was more than just a place with a tragic history. It was a place where something dark had taken root, feeding on the fear and pain of those who lived there. That night, John decided to revisit the attic, where he had first found Emily's letters. He felt drawn back to that space, as though there was something he had missed, something that would help him understand what had happened to her. As he climbed the narrow stairs, the air grew colder, and the familiar creak of the floorboards echoed in the darkness. Once in the attic, John carefully examined the chest where he had found the letters. But this time, he noticed something else, a small trapdoor hidden beneath an old rug. His pulse quickened as he knelt down and pried the door open. Beneath it, he found a narrow crawl space that extended deep into the house. Taking a flashlight, John crawled into the narrow space, the cold air biting at his skin. The further he went, the more claustrophobic it felt, as though the walls were closing in around him. After what felt like an eternity, he reached the end of the crawl space, where he found a small alcove carved into the foundation of the house. Inside the alcove, he found something unexpected, a bundle of old, yellowed papers tied together with string. The papers were fragile, but the writing on them was still legible. They appeared to be notes, written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. As John read through them, a sickening realization dawned on him. The notes were written by a man named Richard Ellis, who had lived in the house in the early 1900s. Richard had documented his descent into madness, describing how he had been plagued by visions, by voices that whispered to him in the night. But the most disturbing part was the way he described the entity that had haunted him, a presence that seemed to feed on his fear, growing stronger the more terrified he became. Richard had tried to escape, but the house wouldn't let him go. In his final note, he wrote, "It is not the house. It is what lies beneath. It watches, it waits. It knows our fears, and it uses them against us." John's hands trembled as he read the final words. The entity Richard described was exactly what Emily had experienced, and what John was experiencing now. The house wasn't just haunted by the spirits of those who had died there. It was a prison for something much older, something that had been there long before the house was built. John realized with horror that he wasn't just facing the echoes of past tragedies. He was facing the same malevolent force that had driven so many before him to madness and death. And now, it was coming for him too. John sat in the darkened living room, his mind racing after the discovery of Richard Ellis' notes in the crawl space. The house had never been about just Emily or Sarah, or any of the others who had lived and died there. It was about something far older, something malevolent, lurking beneath the surface of the land itself. It had taken people over the centuries, feeding off their fear, trapping them in a cycle of madness and death. And now, it had its sights set on him. But John wasn't ready to give in. He couldn't let the same fate that claimed Emily consume him. He needed to find a way out, a way to break the cycle. He spent the following days in a haze, consumed by research and conversation with the few locals who were willing to talk about the house's dark past. But no matter how hard he searched, no clear solution emerged. The deeper he went, the more elusive the answers became. Then, one evening, John received an unexpected call from Laura, Emily's friend. She had found more pages from Emily's journal, ones that Emily hadn't sent before her death. The entries were shorter but even more frantic, written in the final days before her accident. The first entry caught John's attention immediately. "I don't think it's just me. I think it's the house. I hear it moving, breathing almost. At night, the sounds are louder. It's like something under the floorboards, alive." The words chilled John. It was a confirmation of what Richard had written so many years before. But Emily's last entry shook him to the core. It wants something. I think it wants us to stay, to be part of it. I can feel it when I'm alone. The pressure, the weight. I can't explain it, but I think the house won't let us leave. I'm scared, John. I don't think I'll survive if I stay here." Emily had known, but she hadn't told him, perhaps because she knew he wouldn't believe her. Or maybe because by the time she realized it, it was already too late. John's stomach tightened with dread. He realized that the house had been manipulating both of them, isolating them from each other, deepening their fear. And now, it was doing the same to him. The following days were filled with an increasing sense of suffocation. The house felt smaller, darker, and every sound seemed to echo through the walls, as if the structure itself was closing in on him. John knew it was only a matter of time before he faced the same fate as Emily and Richard if he didn't act quickly. That night, as the storm raged outside, John sat in the kitchen, the lights flickering as the wind howled through the cracks in the windows. He had reached his breaking point. There was no more time for hesitation. He had to confront whatever was in the house, to face it head-on before it took him too. He grabbed the flashlight and returned to the attic, where the crawlspace beckoned him like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. His heart pounded in his chest as he crawled through the narrow passage, the cold air pressing down on him like an invisible force. This time, he was determined to go deeper, to find whatever it was that lay beneath the foundation of the house. After what felt like an eternity, John reached the alcove where he had found Richard's notes. But this time, he noticed something he had missed before. A small, crumbling section of the foundation that seemed to lead into an even deeper part of the house. With a deep breath, John pushed the stones aside, revealing a narrow tunnel that led further underground. John hesitated for a moment, fear gripping him, but then he thought of Emily, of her final days, of the terror she must have felt. He had to know the truth, no matter how terrifying it was. The tunnel was damp and cold, the walls slick with moisture. The air grew heavier the deeper he went, and the sense of something watching him grew stronger with each step. At the end of the tunnel, John found a small, circular chamber, its walls lined with old, weathered stones. In the center of the room was a strange, makeshift altar, covered in dirt and debris. But what caught John's eye was a set of markings carved into the stone, symbols that seemed ancient, far older than the house itself. John's mind raced. The altar, the symbols, they must have been part of the curse Mrs. Wilson had mentioned. This was where it had all started. The violence, the bloodshed, the suffering that had occurred on this land so long ago had left a scar, and whatever had been unleashed here had been feeding on the fear of those who lived in the house ever since. Suddenly, the air in the chamber grew colder, and a deep, low hum filled the space. John felt a presence around him, heavy, oppressive, like something was pressing down on his chest. He could feel it watching him, waiting. For a moment, John's fear threatened to overwhelm him. But then, something shifted inside him. He wasn't powerless. He had something that the others hadn't. He knew what he was up against, and he wasn't going to let it win. With trembling hands, John reached for his phone and began recording everything he saw. The markings, the altar, the chamber, he documented it all. He knew that even if he didn't make it out, someone else needed to know the truth. The house had claimed too many lives already, and it wouldn't take his without a fight. As the hum grew louder, John felt a strange pull, like the very walls were trying to draw him in, to make him part of the house itself. But he resisted, forcing himself to stay calm, to keep his mind clear. Finally, after what felt like hours, the presence began to fade. The air grew warmer, the oppressive weight lifting from his chest. John stood there, breathing heavily, the flashlight trembling in his hand. He had survived the confrontation, but the house wasn't finished with him yet. John crawled back through the tunnel, his mind racing with everything he had seen. He knew the truth now. The house had been built on cursed land, and the entity that resided there fed on fear and suffering. But it wasn't invincible. It could be resisted. As he reached the attic, John knew what he had to do. He couldn't stay in the house any longer. The cycle had to end with him. He packed his things and left the house that night, driving away without looking back. In the weeks that followed, John moved into a small apartment in town, far from the house that had nearly consumed him. He contacted the authorities, showing them the evidence he had gathered, but they were skeptical, dismissing his claims as stress and paranoia. The house remained standing, its dark history hidden from the world. But John knew the truth. The house was still out there, waiting for its next victim. And though he had escaped, he couldn't help but feel that a part of it would always be with him, lurking in the shadows of his mind, waiting for the day when fear would creep back into his life. And when that day came, John knew that he would have to face the darkness again. But this time, he would be ready.